Let's test your lateral thinking with a quick puzzle. A blind man went into a restaurant and ordered a cup of coffee. When it arrived, he complained that the coffee was not hot enough and requested a fresh cup. When the second cup arrived, he claimed it was the same cup of coffee, just reheated. But how did he know? The cup did not have a crack or anything that distinguished it from the other cups that we used in the restaurant. He could not tell by the temperature of the cup. The outside of the cup was clean. Pause now if you want to take some time to solve this puzzle yourself, or we'll solve it together. This puzzle is tricky because it subtly focuses our mind on a red herring. For most people, we imagine an image of a blind man holding a cup of coffee. We assume he is using his sense of touch to determine that he has the same cup. The puzzle steers us down this path by mentioning characteristics of the cup. We might get distracted here, thinking the solution is in the cup itself. We may have focused in too quickly and closed our minds to different solutions. Let's zoom out and think of other possibilities that don't involve the cup. The man being blind is both a clue and also a subtle misdirection. Being blind tells us that there is nothing visual about the cup of coffee that helped the man determine it was the same cup. We might get a bit carried away and think this blind man, due to his lack of sight, has other super senses. Maybe his hearing is so good he overheard one waitress tell another to just give him the same cup back. The problem with this line of thought is that we're adding complexity, and Occam's razor tells us that the simplest solution is likely the correct one. So we're probably off track when we add complexity in this way. When we're thinking about this scene, this blind man in a restaurant, we may have locked in our minds a single point in time, that being after he has given the cup back for a second time. However, the puzzle also mentions what happened before this. Let's widen our thinking to include the whole timeline. When we do, we remember that the man sent the first cup of coffee back because it wasn't hot enough. This tells us something. For the man to know the coffee was cold, he must have tasted it before he sent it back. When we think about the timeline in detail, we realize there are important events that occurred that the puzzle doesn't state explicitly, but can be reasonably assumed. The key word here being reasonably. What we do know is that the man perceived that the cup of coffee was the same. And how do we perceive things? Through our senses. Generally, our 5 primary senses. So, let's practice some deductive reasoning and run through the 5 senses. Firstly, sight. Well, the man is blind, so I think we can safely assume that he didn't use his sense of sight. Secondly, smell. There is a possibility the man could smell it was the same cup of coffee, but doesn't all coffee smell pretty much the same? Thirdly, touch. We may have got caught up here, but the clues pretty much tell us that he didn't feel his way to his conclusion. Next, sound. As we mentioned, the man may have overheard the waitresses, or maybe another customer at the restaurant said something. But again, this was never mentioned in the puzzle, so we should be cautious before jumping to such a conclusion. And lastly, taste. Could the man have perceived that the coffee was the same by taste? Well, maybe. We know that he likely tasted the coffee before sending it back. This is how he knew it was cold. And he likely tasted it when it returned. That's a clue. But doesn't all coffee taste the same? Well, mostly. But some people like to add sugar to their coffee, and they almost always add sugar before they take their first sip. And this leads to our solution. When the blind man received the first cup of coffee, he added sugar, then took his first sip. He determined it was too cold, and so sent it back. When the second cup of coffee arrived, he took a sip and was able to taste the sugar he had already added. By considering the whole timeline of events, we get a clearer picture of what happened. The key here is to consider what is likely and reasonable. Our solution assumes that the man added sugar to his coffee. This is a reasonable assumption. We may have also assumed that he overheard two disgruntled waitresses plotting to give him the same coffee back. This is a less reasonable assumption. When we assume something, and often we have to, we should always proceed with the simplest of assumptions. Remember Occam's razor, the simplest solution is likely the correct one. To formulate our solution, we also used deductive reasoning. We thought about the 5 primary senses one at a time and eliminated those that didn't offer any clues, leaving us with taste, which ultimately led to our answer. This simple puzzle gives us insight into how we think. It demonstrates how we can get stuck on one train of thought and our susceptibility to red herrings. But when we alter our thinking to accommodate for such cognitive traps, we can overcome them. We also need to remember that solving problems like this and those we encounter day to day is a process. If the answer doesn't come to us immediately, and it's unlikely to do so, we need to work the problem to arrive at our solution. This involves patience and persistence. Lateral thinking is a valuable skill. By practicing and learning through simple puzzles like this, you set yourself up to solve actual problems in the real world. And that is what really matters.